Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session. If you are new here, hello. Thank you so much for coming today or listening today, I should say. Um, and also, thank you for your ongoing support if you're returning as a session listener. My name is Mandy Rourke, and I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, an LMFT in Austin. I support couples, individuals, and families from a very systemic perspective. I also support clients through telehealth in Texas. And I'm also excited to acknowledge that I'm a co-founder of Zesho.
Yeah. And I'm Dr. Sapna Srivastav, also a PhD in marriage and family therapy, and also a fellow co-founder of Zesho. Zesho is a platform that we started to help clinicians create mental health resources to make them more accessible for everyone. And our Zessions podcast is an arm of that. Zessions are intended to be conversations amongst clinicians, so we can talk about topics that are typically addressed in the mental health world from the perspective of clinicians and therapists who talk to clients on a regular basis.
Yes. And today you'll notice that it's Sapna and I, and a lot of times or most of the time, we tend to have our therapist friends that are partners with us through Zesho and part of our Zesho community. But today it's Sapna and I rolling with the two of us, and we're excited because this topic that we are getting into today is definitely something that I have a lot of passion around. The topic is preparing or prepping for marriage and long-term relationships. We were just talking before we got started that the prepping for marriage could be a little misleading. We don't want this conversation to be leading in that, the benefit of these types of conversations and counseling are intended for marriage. It's just such a commonly used word or construct when it comes to long-term relationships. And so just want to kind of define that from the start. Maybe I am jumping ahead already, but that's our topic is like long-term relationships, long-term commitment, and just preparing for that. And this is something that when I was first probably in practicum, I loved these couples that would come, and it quickly became almost, dare I say, like a safe spot in therapy. Like it felt like a fun spot in couples therapy because there were so many proactive conversations that we could have with one another. It seemed like a lot of these couples that we would meet, granted, there was heavy and hard things we would talk about, but there's also like a lot of excitement and hope because it's the beginning of the relationship where, there haven't been kind of established or fixed conflict patterns and things like that, which we'll get into all that stuff today. But it definitely has been a specialty and an area of focus for many years. And my work as a couples therapist. So I'm super excited to be here with you, Sapna, talking about this, nerding out like we like to do.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited that we're finally having this conversation, especially because I know it's been a specialty of yours for a while, but working with couples, working towards long-term commitment and or premarital, as the more, traditional slash structured sense tends to call it, it tends to be one of my favorites as well. They often tend to be some of my favorite cases and sessions. Um, and so there's just so much here that we're gonna get into that I'm excited about. But before we do, a little housekeeping. So just a friendly reminder, if you do enjoy our content, please do consider liking, following, and or giving a positive rating or review wherever you do listen to podcasts. We super appreciate it. It means a lot to us. And it also really helps other people find the materials that we're putting out in hopes that they find the right people that they can be of benefit to. So we really appreciate any support and amplification in that process. Also, you can follow us on any social media. We love to hear from y'all. We love to hear any feedback, any thoughts, any questions, or just any suggestions. You can find us on really any social media platform. Our handle is at myzeshow. And you can also find us on YouTube if you want to watch the pretty faces of your Zesha co-founders, if I do say so myself, as I'm a little extra gussied up today. And you don't have to watch on YouTube for that, though. Please listen wherever you want. Um, and anyways, you can also find us there, and you can also find us at our website, zesho.com. That's Zesio.com.
Love it. Like how many people just hit pause on their Spotify or
Because
their
people are
podcast. They're like,
just
you know what? Let's go
leaving.
check
They're
this
just be
out.
like, this girl.
Yeah, let's go see what she's gussied up. Let's see what that looks like. Oh, I love it so much.
All part of the YouTube plan.
Yeah, great.
They're gonna be like,
Um,
what? You look normal.
yeah, no, you look good, girl.
Thanks. Right back at you.
So yeah, as we're kind of rolling into this, this is as we, already kind of shared that we're talking about marriage, we're talking about long-term commitment, and like when we say that, we're really this can mean something just every like it can mean something different to any and everyone. When it comes to like what is a long-term relationship or a long-term commitment, there's not like a set, I don't think there's like a set, you need to be in a relationship for 6 months in order for this to apply to you, or you need to be in a monogamous relationship for this to apply to you. No, this to me is more of conversations around building a life with another person and really being curious around like what do we want in this life together and how do we want to build and cultivate the life that we individually want but we also want as a relationship, or maybe we want long term as a family, or even shared blended families, which we'll talk about. So when we say, and we're kind of getting into this, it's just want to be really clear that like sometimes when people think of premarital, it's like, oh, is this marriage counseling or is this religious based counseling? Because oftentimes there are a lot of like programs that are actually like premarital programs. I think like Prepare and Enrich might be one of them. If I might be have that wrong, but it is more religiously based, or it's used in a lot of churches. And so I just want to kind of differentiate that this is not coming from a religious perspective at all. If clients come to me and they want to talk about their own faith, beliefs, then that's something, of course, we'll have conversations according to like what feels good to them. But feels important to say that from the start that we really are thinking of this just according to, maybe that's very collaborative in the way that I work with clients of like, what is it that they see in their relationships? How do they define their own relationship? And it could be after, I don't know, amount of time, if they just feel that there's potential here and this is someone that they want to, make that commitment with and whatever that looks like going forward. So kind of just starting off our conversation with that.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for throwing that in because especially when we'll probably use the phrase premarital a lot because that is kind of like a segment of therapy, I suppose, but it really isn't intending to be exclusive. It really is intended to be inclusive for all kinds of relationships, and whether it's intended to be in a religious context or not, like you said, whether it's with just one partner or multiple partners, there's lots of benefits to engaging in what is traditionally called premarital therapy. But what do we mean more specifically by premarital therapy? Like, what's usually involved? What does it usually look like when you see clients for quote
Well,
unquote premarital?
it can vary. I mean, one thing just to kind of attend to this real quick. I definitely have couples who come in that want to have a lot of reflective conversations to it's almost like a version of discernment counseling for some, where it's like, is this relationship going to kind of go the long, for like make it for the long haul. Like there might be a lot of fears and doubts within that. And so some of those conversations are used just to like assess and kind of determine like um where are we going with this relationship? We think it's long term, but we need to have some conversations about like can we commit to that, or what do we need to focus on in order to do that. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that too, that I think some people might be scared off. Like, I don't know if that's the right way of saying it, but like, if I'm in a relationship with someone that I really care about, but I'm like, I don't know what our next steps are, and I hear premarital, I'm like, oh, does my partner now think that we're doing this because the end goal or the finish line is marriage? And so just wanted to say that real quick before going further too. And as far as like, what do we like, is premarital counseling, or is this type of counseling like the same as other versions of couples therapy? I would say not really. I do feel like when people come in and especially when they say, "Hey, we want to focus on more premarital stuff," or we want to like have some of this like, we're focusing on long-term compatibility. If those are things that they're kind of bringing to the table, an initial conversation would usually help me determine, are they looking for me to sort of guide them through key relational areas, almost like a relationship, like check-in of ways, or like almost like you're going to your doctor, like let's do a relationship physical for a second and be like, are all the parts of my body working well, or all the parts of our relationship working well, or that sort of thing. And so I do think that just from my experience, a lot of people that seek this sort of couples therapy do tend to like more of a structured approach where maybe each session we kind of hit a certain relational component. But there's also some people that come in seeking this sort of counseling and will basically say like, we kind of know what our strengths are, and we know that there are a few areas that we haven't been able to talk about on our own. And so, dare I say, like kind of problem areas or struggle areas that we just want a professional to help us talk those things out. It's not that they're worried about the longevity of their relationship or they're in like a great deal of conflict. It's that they need a third party to help them have some of these more in-depth conversations that might not be natural.
Yeah. Uh, I I also agree. I think that's been my experience too, for the most part, whenever I've seen couples either before they're wanting to get engaged or get married, or even just kind of as a relationship check-in of like, we think we want to do this long term, but we kind of need to figure out what our blind spots are. And I think I've also had folks who have um, typically like more structure, but I think I take a similar approach to you and kind of like ask. I also, you mentioned Prepare and Enrich earlier, and I am certified in that. And so I'll use that curriculum if they want to, but I'll usually check in. And I don't know that I think it's maybe oriented towards more like clergy friendly, so that it can
Yeah.
be used, but I don't know that it's necessarily specifically Christian. I could be wrong on that too. It's been a minute since I've used it. Um, but I usually give folks an option of like how they would like it, but typically some structure, typically some particular topics,
Mhm.
or really knowing what they are coming for, and then kind of collaborate on like what it looks like and how many sessions, unless we're trying to get a discount on our marriage license, and so it has to be a certain number of hours in that case.
Yeah.
Um,
I will say that I do get a lot of inquiries for the Together in Texas program. There's an initiative at a statewide level to create healthy long-term relationships. And so they do get a discount on marriage license, and I think they can skip the waiting period. So I'll have some people last minute be like, ah, can we get in so we can get discount and like not have to wait for our marriage license? We want to elope and things like that. So, but within that program, they have to take like 8 full hours worth of therapy in order to
yeah,
qualify or to get their certificate. So that in itself, just like from the system, kind of creates a little bit of like an imposed structure. But there's plenty of people who have come to me and they're like, I don't care about a certificate or a discount. It's more of just like, we want to feel really responsible is a lot of the feedback I get, like feel really confident that, before we say I do or before we're moving in together, for instance, is another big area that people come in. Like, if we're going to take that next step, let's kind of make sure we're talking about all the things that will help us have more like security in
mm,
moving forward. So yeah, that's definitely something to consider as well.
yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. So that was actually going to lead to my next question for you,
Mhm.
for us. But maybe we can start with, you said that there's some topics or some areas that they want more confidence in. What are some of those topics? What do those tend to be usually?
Yeah, this is one where I feel like when I first started helping, I did use more of like a prepare, enrich, some, different types of assessment and things like that. And then throughout the years of helping therapy or helping clients, it kind of became clear that like we have like very set areas that we tend to want to talk about. And so, I mean, this is probably very much in alignment with a lot of those other more formal assessments. I don't practice that formally, but the ones that come to mind, and the one that's actually supported in a course that I created too, is that there's like 10 or 11 kind of main topics. We want to talk about your families. Within this, it's like we want to understand like your family of origin, so each individual's family history, but we also want to understand what does family mean to you? What has been your experience in family? What are your hopes and expectations for a family going forward? Whether that's creating a family with a partner or that's blending families from previous relationships. And so that's definitely a big topic. Oh, I'm not even thinking about like current day family dynamics, whether it be like talking about in-laws. There tends to be a lot of conversations around like how do we navigate boundaries with our families and also like how to navigate transitions and being in a romantic long-term relationship and how that kind of shifts the way that um, you may interact with your own family or just kind of, your life kind of takes a slightly different shape. We talk a lot about individual history being a second part of this. And sometimes we even get into relationship history too, because again, this isn't like for new couples. This can be conversations amongst couples that have been together for several years and now are like, okay, like we want to check in and really do our due diligence, if you will, for kind of strengthening our relationship. And so that individual history is very important from my perspective as a couples therapist too, because there's so much. I mean, there can be individual traumas that have been experienced, whether that be in previous relationships. There can even be interpersonal traumas and hurt that has been experienced in that relationship that we need to touch on because that can definitely influence communication, intimacy, the conflict, all of that. So we really want to have a very as clear of a understanding about each individual's history and kind of like what's your individual story, which actually kind of ties in with one section that feels really important to me is like what's our story as a relationship, like what drew us together, why were we drawn together, like what do we want our story to be, in the future. We talk a lot about values. So that's another big section of like, what are the things that guide you in your life, that charge you in the life, where are your individual values aligned, where maybe they're not. That's very important because there tends to be a lot of conflict in relationships and values don't align. Not that that's like a guaranteed, but there can be some friction around that. Like, hey, like this is important to me. Why aren't we doing this? Where they're like, that's not that important to me. Like you do that. I don't want to sort of situations. But then I also think there's a helpful exercise in like having like what do we want our relationship to, like what are our shared relationship values, like things that can kind of drive our relationship, almost like getting into some of the philosophy of our relationship. We definitely talk about finances. I'm sure many people have heard like finances can be something that can really cause a lot of conflict in relationships. And I think it can when there's not like structure and like clear systems around that, clear communication. We talk about intimacy. That's a very big topic, whether that be sexual, physical, emotional, spiritual, intellectual intimacy. We talk about how to navigate in the home, what are roles and responsibilities within the home? What does it look like just to live together? What are your hopes, fears, desires around sharing space with each other? Conflict. This is an interesting one. We definitely talk about it. And some couples come in because they are having conflict and they're like, we want to kind of resolve some of this stuff before we get married, or we want to understand this better before we, move in together, like really commit long term. And so that's an interesting one because sometimes again it can be really clear, but there's other times where I've met with couples and they're like, yeah, like things are great. We're fine. And so it's like, all right, well, let's just talk about some things that, some strategies around conflict that could be helpful in the future if you're not in honeymoon phase anymore that you might want to consider. So that's definitely a big area along with communication. Those two kind of go hand in hand, but it's also just like, we're almost starting to model like how to have some of the hard conversations in a container that then these couples can go out and fine tune to their own benefit. And then lastly, the future, what do you want your future to look like? But these can be hard conversations too, of like, what might we need to anticipate in our future? Because it is hard when you're really excited about, your wedding's like 6 months away. And it's like, I don't really want to talk about aging parents when I'm, in my early 30s. And like right now we're just talking about getting married. And like, yeah, absolutely. We can do both. We can be really excited and we can also be really proactive about having some conversations around like, what were your expectations? Oh, you were thinking your mom's going to move in with us. Good to know. I did not have that in mind, and now we have some conversation around that to help that not be a surprise, many, many years down the line. So I just kind of spit it all out at you there, but that's where my mind goes with the topics.
Yeah, that's super, super thorough. And just yeah, I appreciate that. I think that's a whole list of topics that it sounds like it's pretty important for most couples to really dive into if they haven't already, especially if they are considering any kind of a long-term relationship or commitment. Um, I yeah, I wanted to acknowledge that conflict and communication can be their own, like they're coming in before they're getting married, but really there's a lot of conflict and communication. And then, sometimes we transition into more of these topics broadly. Sometimes we just stay on conflict and communication for a while. But I especially love that you're also throwing in those future scenarios too, and like those details. It sounds like there's a lot of tendency of couples in their honeymoon phase to really just be like, yeah, things are great. Like we're really excited for the wedding or we're excited for our future, which is wonderful and we love that. And that's part of why we really enjoy working with couples in this stage. And also, there's a lot to consider in the future that like might be not as much hunky-dory as it's being painted to be. And so how do you kind of balance that usually with couples? Because I would imagine it can sometimes be not as easy to broach those topics, or they might kind of steer clear of them, not only on their own, but also with you. Might be making that up.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot to that because, I have like couples examples from experience popping in my mind right now where there can be a lot of fear, right? Like you're really excited about this. Maybe this is someone you've been looking for, seeking for a long time. And so it's like, yes, like we found each other, like we feel good about this. Like let's not rock the boat. Let's just keep full steam ahead. Or that's a train, but it works.
Of
Um,
transportation.
but yeah, I mean, I think that it can be really scary to be like, let's open up stuff we haven't talked about. It's almost like, well, what might we find out that could that shift our commitment in some way? Could it dissolve it in some way if it's like we're at an impasse? And so I definitely have noticed that in my experience. And I think that, as you were just talking, it made me realize that these conversations are really setting the stage of what more is to come in a long-term relationship and what more is needed in a long-term relationship is like getting really comfortable with having hard conversations, vulnerable conversations, uncertain conversations, also conversations that might not have an immediate solution. So like knowing how to kind of sit in that space of not knowing, or sit in the space of, um, yeah, I guess I'm kind of repeating myself, just like we can't resolve this, but we need to just kind of try to understand it. And so I do really like that about this style of therapy where it's like, let's just try to get comfortable with sitting in this and like giving your thoughts and your feelings, like bringing them out, like saying this stuff out loud so that that almost becomes the way that your relationship functions, where it's like, yeah, okay, this is going to be a hard thing to bring up, but like, I know we can do it because we've learned how to have these conversations in a way where even if, again, we can't solve them, we can try to at least understand it. And then I think it also like opens up this opportunity for couples to be able to it's like this concept of multiplicity, like sit in a space where you don't know, and maybe there is some doubt, but then to also recognize like there's so much good, there's so many strengths here. And like we have to be able to in a long-term relationship sit in that because it's not always going to be perfect. I mean, I don't know if it's ever really perfect, but like, there's natural challenges that long-term relationships go through. I mean, one thing just to hit on real fast is like, theoretically speaking, there's like the honeymoon phase that then quickly goes into the power struggle, right? Which is so like it happens with, I would say, most relationships where it's like this tug of war. And so it's like, let's get good at like understanding those dynamics, but also like it's not black or white. It's not because we're having conflict in this area that the relationship is doomed or there's like this catastrophic, ending coming. It's like let's get really like as comfortable as we can, like navigating these phases. And so I do think that just starts with like getting comfortable with having conversations that maybe you don't really want to have, but could be good to have.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Especially with someone who can help guide you around how to have those conversations and what topics to focus on and kind of help navigate that if especially if that's not a habit or if that's not like a regular thing that's happening, which oftentimes can be the case, especially in that honeymoon phase, right? Of things are pretty, smooth sailing and we're gonna ride that through and let's not rock this boat quite literally and so sometimes it's not as easy to more directly confront some of those topics that can be challenging and could bring up some form of conflict or um, disagreement. And especially if there's any or both partners who are any kind of non-confrontational. I don't know if you've ever run across that.
Oh yeah.
Um, but yeah, I can imagine that that is definitely a huge benefit of having these topics discussed in a therapeutic setting with a therapist so that you have the support additionally of how to have these conversations. What are we missing? And what are the tools that we can start to build and add to our toolbox and practice using as we kind of continue onward and start having some more of these conversations. Sometimes it's already happening, and sometimes they're not happening very well. And so that's also why
Yeah.
they're coming in too. Um, but I'm also wondering what it can sometimes look like if couples haven't had these conversations or have missed some of these topics and are a couple years in and I would imagine that happens and like what does that usually look like? Have you encountered that with couples?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think there can be some hesitation around having really intense, vulnerable conversations. And so it could be that, people are like gridlocked in like fear and doubt around like how do I do that? Like what does that look like in my own space? Like am I gonna try to say like, hey, on Sunday, let's sit down and have a check-in about these things. It's like kind of directionless. It can be. I'm not suggesting
Hmm.
that that's for every relationship, but it's like, what are the norms of how we like have these conversations? And like that's not super natural. I don't feel like in a relationship. I mean, I think it can vary. I mean, some people maybe are more structured and naturally find themselves doing that kind of thing, but I would say that a lot of couples that I've worked with tend to have, something that they want some support in, whether that be intimacy, where it's like, hey, we've tried talking about this, but it gets a lot, there ends up with a lot of hurt feelings, and we just really want to understand this better. And so we need a third party to help us like kind of sift through what we're saying because since it is such a vulnerable and intimate conversation in itself. I've had a lot of couples come in talking about finances and trying to figure out, like, I'm not I do have a background in banking, funny enough, but like, I'm not a financial advisor, but it's more of like, I'm so scared. Like, my parents got a divorce because of money. And while everything in our relationship feels pretty awesome, like, I'm terrified about what this is going to look like down the future. And like, if I talk about it, it's almost like, I could get too dysregulated, like too frantic about this. And like, the conversation could just be more of like like a panic kind of conversation versus an objective one. And so that's what I really try to help couples do is see it from like, hey, like let's try to zoom out and say like there's all these different facets of your relationship that we can just take some space and start to get really curious around, what are your individual feelings on that? What are your individual concerns, which is feelings, right? And how can we talk about it in a way that can create some new meaning between the two of you? Am I answering your question? I feel like I could go off in many different directions on that one.
You are. And I think there are many directions to go off
Yeah,
in.
for
I
sure.
do want to reemphasize too, you were saying before that a lot of conflict is just ongoing and it's never not going to be. And so just a friendly reminder for all who are listening and don't already know that according to John Gottman, there is like 69% I think of conflict is perpetual, like there's never going to be a resolution on it, so like let's normalize that, but also like this is a way to like practice and start becoming accustomed to having those conversations and like navigating that together. I figure that can also probably be really daunting to people if like we're never going to resolve this, like what.
Well, yeah, that and again, like there's a lot of conversation around, I want to do this differently than what I observed, and I want to show up differently than maybe how do I say this? Maybe what feels like default, like maybe I never got to see a relationship display affection or communication. I mean, I meet with a lot of people who, going back to kind of the avoidance piece of this, I'm like, no fault of theirs. Like maybe their families didn't talk about things. And so it's like and that might feel very natural. And there's no criticism behind that. I think we can understand, okay, if you weren't used to talking about things, but you have a partner who's very used to talking about things because their family talked about things like to the point where it was anything and everything was talked about. It's like, all right, like that can create a lot of challenges around, well, this person never wants to talk about this. Well, this person always wants to talk about this. And so kind of hitting a little bit into like communication and conflict here, but I think that there's a lot of conversation around how to talk about things and how to really think through conflict with more of a responsive lens. Like, what are we aiming to do when we have these conversations? Are we aiming to just get into like what we like to refer to as like the red zone, where it's like, if we're mad, we just act on it. Does that feel okay for us? Like, is that how we want our conflict style to be long term? And, couples tend to not really like that. It doesn't really feel good to have like intense, volatile conflict. But I think conversations and premarital can really help just even say, okay, this is how y'all started off your relationship based on kind of the current like approach to your relationship. Good. Like we know that now. And now it's like, how do you want to communicate going forward? And, an example of that would be someone saying like, I grew up in a family that yelled all the time and I didn't like it, but yet I still find myself yelling. And it's like, I don't want to yell in this relationship. And so it's like, okay, let's understand maybe some of the triggers to that type of reaction. Let's also understand what, if you don't want to yell, how do you want to interact in those times? And then I think that it can be so beautiful to watch couples have this conversation where it's like, hey, like when we get to that place where I'm yelling or I'm starting to raise my voice, like we can come in with some really great gentle strategies of like, hey, you know what? Let's take a break for a second. We'll come back to this because, again, we're working towards something. Like we're working towards having a more responsive version of communicating, which is to regulate our emotions and figure out what it is that we're feeling and why we're feeling that, what we want to communicate in a way that is in alignment with our goals of, the one I was just sharing a little while ago of like more calm, connected communication versus like maybe hostile or harsh. And so there's so many layers to that, but a lot of times couples are like, well, this is how it was in my family, like it should be fine. And I'm like, well, you tend to have a mirror, reflected right back onto you, being like, well, that doesn't really work in this relationship. And we're going to have to figure out maybe what our own shared language is, or like how to do this dance when we get angry so that we're not just like stepping on each other, or like, pulling the rug out from underneath each other, or sweeping things under the rug, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. I keep being struck by um I mean, obviously, we're both a little biased, and we think that there's a lot of benefits to therapy, generally, just as a whole. But it's also really known that, like, especially for couples, like the sooner that you can go to therapy, like the better a chance there is for being able to correct and readdress and like redirect some of those patterns. And I feel like even more so for premarital, because you talked about like we have the chance to choose here and we have the chance to inspect. And it's oftentimes before you get really gridlocked into those patterns that are maybe like at head with each other, right?
Mhm.
And and that's so unique. That's such a unique opportunity. Like, how often is that truly a thing that you're able to do with help from professionals who see those gridlocks and try to help people through those gridlocks on a regular basis that you can actually work through it? And so I appreciate that. I want to plug that a
Well,
little bit
yeah, I
more.
mean, I think that's a really good thing to acknowledge that, or as you're just acknowledging that, I was thinking there is like a psychoeducational component of this, maybe. I mean, I think there is psychoeducation in a lot of versions of therapy, so that's not unique to this, but maybe in some ways there is more emphasis on, some of those strategies or concepts. I mean, even today, just talking about how there's like the honeymoon phase to a power struggle to the joining, and like I think that even sharing that with a couple from the start, or that there are patterns for conflict or patterns for communication or intimacy, and we can get gridlocked in that. Like, even as you were saying that, I was thinking, like, I'm taking a deep breath because there's some relief in the fact of, like, oh, okay, like, if 10 years down the line, we're getting to the same argument over and over and over again, it's almost like I have a point of reference when we were like, whoa, oh, okay, it looks like we might have just gotten ourselves into a pattern, right? Like, I can be more objective if I have more of this education around how relationships can function. And so then it helps me like identify some of those struggles later on down the line, not to fully like diagnose, but to just have more of those reference points again to be like, like, here's an example with intimacy. I have worked with couples that have been married or together for years and years and years, and they may come in being like, our intimacy completely sucks. We have no intimacy. And then when we start peeling back those layers, it's like, well, they actually might just be lacking in sexual intimacy, but they have physical intimacy, they have intellectual, or they have that emotional, or like maybe they're suffering in many areas, but it also just kind of expands what that initial thought was, is like, we're doomed. It's like, hold on, like, yeah, I hear that you feel that, right? Like, I can tell that you're struggling in that. And let's also consider that there's a lot of different areas of intimacy. And so, like, even just like learning that, I've seen people's relief on their face of like, cool, like, well, if I can like hone in on more of that intellectual intimacy, how might that shift in the sexual context of our sexual intimacy and things like that. So, yeah, I do think we're biased. I think I could sit here and sell premarital counseling all day, but I do think that it helps them, couples have more tools essentially in their toolbox to be like, okay, problem area, how do we fix this? And if we can't fix it, then we know that we can call on others to help.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I also in the back of my mind have some people who I've heard ask like why do couples even come in before like they're married or like are having issues? Like what's the point? And like this is definitely the point. There's such a benefit in like having a bit of a roadmap and those anticipatory like landmarks that you can be like, okay, this is nothing to freak out over. This is pretty normal. We were told like this is probably going to happen. And we're in this stage now. Like, if we're still struggling, we know that we can come back to a resource. But we don't have to freak out that this is happening. We don't have to blow it up and out of proportion. Like, let's just move through it.
Yeah, it's
And
almost like it gets normalized from the start. Like, yeah, you're gonna have challenges. Like it would be weird if you
Yeah.
didn't,
Yeah.
like you're
Yeah.
gonna have moments where you're kind of like, whoa, we gotta course correct. And like when it happens, you're like, okay, right on time. Like this is what most relationships tend to have to navigate. I'm not
Yeah.
alone in this. It doesn't mean, again, our relationship, like it helps with that worst case scenario thinking of like, it's done. We can't solve it. It's like, no, no, hold on.
Yeah.
Let's
Yeah.
slow that down for a second. Let's kind of revisit some of these things.
Yeah, exactly. Which I feel like a lot of people don't necessarily know what to expect out of a long-term relationship until they get into something like
Mhm.
premarital therapy. And like I just wish there's so much more widespread information on like what to expect in a long-term relationship, how to navigate it, and really how to help it become actually long-term and
Mhm.
stay long-term, hopefully, fingers crossed.
Yeah.
And uh, so this is I mean, yeah, I'll stop plugging. But that's part of why I think we both love this type of therapy so much too, is like it's such a great opportunity at the beginning to really be proactive and I tend to compare therapy. One of my favorite analogies, anyways, is it's like going to the gym, but like instead of just waiting to go to the gym until your doctor says like you have to, otherwise like your actual health and longevity is compromised, like starting to go like on a regular basis just to kind of preemptively, make sure that you're staying healthy and you're doing okay and like your body is functioning the way that it's supposed to and at its best ideally. And so um that's definitely a huge reason why
Yeah,
therapy
I
can.
like I like that example, and it does make me think about how some of the most productive conversations, be it in premarital or even just like couples therapy, happen when the couple isn't in crisis. Because, I work with a lot of couples who are in high conflict and high levels of emotional crisis. They've hit a point where they're like in a helpless, defeated state. And it takes a lot of time to help that couple navigate that discomfort and that dysregulation, the system anxiety, the like the breakdown that's happening. And it's like those conversations are very much more like in response to something very challenging happening. And so it's almost like putting the fire out type of conversations. And there might be some of those conversations. There have been, of course, there will be some of, I should say, those types of conversations in premarital. So if that is the case for you, like don't feel like that's a bad thing.
Yeah, totally
It's just
normal.
like something to acknowledge that um, it can be just such a beneficial time to sit down and be like, if we can try to help set our foundation as such that it feels really steady and strong, that can help us when if we are met with some sort of crisis, then it's like, okay, like crisis mode. Let's take a minute. And again, that kind of goes back into the psychoeducation piece, but all this to say that like I feel like when you're in it tends to be that couples come to these conversations in a more regulated state is really the point of like, okay, like I'm kind of in like game time mode, like what do I want? Like how do I feel? What am I thinking about the future versus like, there's this massive thing that we have to sort through right now. And again, that might be the case too, but it might also be a blend of that.
Yeah, absolutely. It gives that more of an opportunity at least for there to be like really productive long-term conversations rather than just attending to the immediate
Mhm.
emotion and oftentimes hurt that's really driving things. But I also want to zoom back out and ask more about what are some of the topics that tend to be most challenging for couples to address? I know you gave like a huge list of topics that was phenomenal. But of those or even other ones, what are areas that you seem to see couples like really struggling with pretty regularly?
Families is a big one because it's such a loaded area. Families can be, like I said before, we're talking about each of our individual families that we came from. And that is, we had a session over adjustments and transitions several months ago that attends to some of this, but it is a very big transition to basically shift from like one group, if you will. It doesn't mean you completely exit this group that's your initial family or your family of origin. But I mean, I'll speak for myself. This might be an easier way of describing it. I do remember there being a transition from me like starting to seek out, like I went to my partner first for things. And I remember being like, whoa, this is different. I used to go to my parents for stuff first, and now I'm like going to my partner. And that was something that kind of naturally transitioned and I think the way that like worked for my relationship, but also there can be challenges with that too. And I'm not suggesting that's how it has to be that like you go to your partner before you go to other people, but I think that kind of illuminates a little bit of the struggle there of like if I want to create this new unit, if you will, with this new person or this person that I really love and care for, that does naturally change the way that the other systems are. Like there's more energy going into a relationship that used to be maybe in these other relationships. And so there is this like shift that can happen, and so there can be a lot of reactions from families within that. There can be a lot of struggles within that transition too. There can be a lot of grief within families as well. And there can be a lot of challenge and conflict within the couple as well, because, everyone's family, it might be very different. They might be really similar. They might have values of like close family or not close family. And so there's so many layers of trying to figure out, like how do we engage with our families in a way that like is conducive to what we want as a relationship or that feels good to us, like I think boundaries are a big thing here of like how do we use our time or even when it comes to like when is family welcome to come over, what is the kind of systems around that. And then I think, I mean, there's so much more to that, but that's the first step that comes to mind. And then I think the other part of families is like, what do we want our family to look like? Like, do we want to have kids? Do we not? Are we blending families together? I mean, I do work with a lot of couples who are on their second marriage, third, like, multiple long-term commitments, and they're blending families. And so that tends to be like a very big source of conversation to figure out like, how do we blend this in a way that works for us as a romantic relationship, kind of the leaders of this relationship, but then also for all the individual parties? And again, I think going to decide, are we going to have kids? Are we not? How many kids are we going to have? What does that look like when it comes to, is it adoption? Is it IVF? Are we open to abortion? Are we not? Like, what does our family planning look like? And having those conversations very explicitly feels really important because I've certainly worked with couples way down the line that they were like, had no idea that kids were off the table until we're so, you know, um, all of our lives are so intertwined. And it's like, now what is it? I choose to have a baby and I don't have a relationship, So it's like hard conversations, but definitely helpful to just like have them with some support. So yeah, families is a huge one. Definitely finances, definitely intimacy. Um, yeah, I feel like I'm kind of repeating myself from earlier, but we've already talked about conflict and communication is definitely part of any kind of conversation. Um, so yeah, all of them.
All of them, but especially families.
Mhm. It does tend to, because it's almost like, yeah, I'm creating like I don't believe that a family is only a family when you have children
Mhm.
or if it's a big family. I mean, or that you have a pet or you don't. It's like you get to decide what family looks like to you. And you are like, okay, like we're wanting to create this together. There's so much that and that's also can be really empowering to be like you said before, like we get to choose. We might be worried about all these areas, but like let's talk about it and come together and figure out like how do we want to navigate this?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That setting precedent with family, I think, is definitely an advantage too. Obviously, you can like retroactively set boundaries always as well, but being able to do it from the beginning is a gift.
Yeah.
Um, yes, all of them. Well, on that note, I also want to go back. Were there any other, I mean, we said all of them, right? But were there any other topics that you would suggest like or that you've seen couples like really just skip? I mean, I know that's somewhat related to I just asked you, but like if they it's easier for them to skip when they're having initial conversations. We just asked that. That's the same as what I just asked you, isn't it?
I don't know. I mean, I think something that there are times that couples come in and they're like, we feel fine when it comes to like household stuff. Like I don't want to spend time and money like talking through who does what around the house. Like we've been living together for a long time. Like that's not our concern. And so that's definitely a topic that I kind of assess like do you live together? Do you plan to live together? Like what is that living arrangement going to be like? And even if you're not living together, what's kind of like the routines that you have are do you feel good about that? Is there some stuff that like you wish could be talked about or like, even just if y'all are spending tons of time, like the pet peeves that can inevitably come up, with how space is shared. But yeah, there's a lot of people that are like, no, we're good. Like that feels very like maybe standard and what people think about premarital is that we're going to go through a checklist of like who takes the trash out, who vacuums. And yeah, that's something I certainly have in a course that we'll share here when we wrap up in a few. But some people are like, we're good. We want to talk about more of the vulnerable type of conversations where we want someone that's safe and that we trust to help us have those.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for your patience with my lack of caffeine in my system
Yeah.
showing.
Yeah.
So speaking of the proactiveness of premarital therapy, like what are some like tips and suggestions that you often give to couples to take with them for continuing to be proactive around these topics and to continue to have these conversations?
Yeah, this Gottman's kind of popped in my head here, which is thinking about your relationship as like the sound relationship house is what he calls it from his research, and the basis of the relationship is friendship. And so it's like having this culture of appreciation and like how do you and like fondness and admiration towards your partner because as like a friend, like how would you treat a friend? And within that it's like how do we invest time to really be like how like do we have fun together? What are our shared interests? Like what are the things that brought us together and are we making sure we're like spending enough time thinking and talking and doing those things? And so I think it starts with just like let's really fortify that friendship and keep focus on that. Because one thing, and I think this might be one of our last questions that was on there, was like, what might change once you get married or you do say, okay, like we've gone through this, we want this long-term commitment. Something that I've seen that can be really sneaky and hard for relationships is like, okay, now we're married and you're my partner. So there's all these expectations that I have for you to be a certain way, by the way. And it's like, whoa, 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 like I'm not saying you can't have any expectations. I think it's more of just like talk through like what more like from a hope, like this is what I'm hoping for, this would be my ideal, but not like a well now that, this person is my spouse, they need to be a certain way or like they need to morph into some other version of a person because do you kind of see what I'm saying with that? Where it's
Mhm.
like it can put all this different pressure. And so then it's like it's almost like they shift away from being like the friend and the lover to more like they fit this role of like now you're my like we're married. You need to be like it can change it in some way of
Yeah,
like now I expect and I
expectations.
have more pressure for performance and like that sort of dynamic.
Mhm.
And so all that to say is like how I really just want to help couples be able to focus on like that friendship, which is a foundation, which comes back into like more of those rituals, which is going to the question you were asking around like, what are the rituals that we have and also traditions for ourselves, like rituals for connection, rituals for intimacy, rituals or like traditions around holidays or traditions around, birthdays or like anything like anniversaries or just like times of year that you really like of like what do we get to how can we fully benefit from like choosing to be with one another? And I think that, there's some tools that you can use for that. There's certainly a lot of apps out there that have like a lot of the they'll send you like a question a week right? To keep relationship focused. And I've had a lot of great feedback from couples who do those sort of apps and programs. There's also like great cards. I know Esther Perel has great conversation cards. So does Gottman on their website. They both have different kind of getting to know you cards. And I think that's one thing to acknowledge of like, I guess I'm referencing another podcast we did, which is around curiosity of like, it's like once you decide you're going to be in a long-term commitment or you're going to get married, that doesn't mean that like, all right, like we're all set. We've done it.
Right. We know each other now.
Yeah, we're good. It's more of like, okay, great. Like we've committed and we want to continue to invest time and energy to like get to know our partner as they continue to evolve because we're evolving and changing too. So I really like those conversational cards. I also like really just having conversation around like how do you want to like celebrate yourselves each year, as a relationship? Like what are those fun things that you never want to lose sight of? Like for us, like we never give each other gifts. We give each other experiences. And we decided that probably after our first like year of being together because we probably had some conflict around gift giving or something, where we're like, this isn't working for us. So we don't have to be in like a gift giving that we don't like that. We want to give each other experiences. And so it's like those are kind of like these rituals that we get to be like, all right, now this is our thing that we get to do. And so it's something that I think can be really securing to be like, what are those rituals for connection? And is it that, it's once a month we go for a long walk and just like catch up around like our short-term, long-term goals, or like just kind of a general check-in around how are you as a person, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I love those. Those are all super helpful. I also just want to clarify, I think we've both mentioned Gottman at this point.
Hmm.
That's John Gottman, who is a couples researcher, a pretty famous couples researcher, and also a plug for their account on social media, the Gottman Institute. They've got great stuff. We'll try and include that in the show notes as well. But okay, one of my last questions here um, is what are maybe signs? We've probably addressed this in some form or another at some point in this conversation, but what are some signs that couples might down the line realize like they need more support, or even sooner than they anticipate, but that they might need a little more support in kind of navigating some conflicts or navigating some of these topics that you do start to address in a premarital context. And that support, whether it's from you again, from a therapist, or either from like a spiritual advisor or other resources, like kind of what are some of those signs for those couples to look out for?
I think that's a good question. I think gridlock is something we've used, like we feel stuck. Maybe we're stuck in conflict or we feel fearful or uncertain around how to have conversations or like how to address like a topic that might be of concern or challenge within the relationship. And so it's like I feel like it might be that you just recognize that you feel helpless and like or you've made multiple attempts and you're again it's like that gridlock like we're unable to compromise or we just feel completely stuck. I think the other one is like just feeling really disconnected. I mean, that can happen. We're like the context of relationships can change over time. And I remember watching one of those dating shows and one of the psychologists was like, you're married to multiple versions of a person. And so there can be like that to me is context, right? Like people change and then the relationship can change. And so it's like, man, like maybe the way that the relationship is right now, I don't feel as connected as I would want to, or like it's not really like fitting kind of what I hoped I would have out of this relationship, or you're starting to be met with some of that disappointment or, lack of you know, intimacy is a big one, right? Where it just feels like we're kind of ships passing in the night, or there's been, major loss is another time where we're just kind of not able to like kind of like rejoin each other based on individual crises and things like that. And so yeah, I think it's basically where, Sapna and I, you and I've talked about this a lot, where like when we feel the sign is like when we feel like we can't navigate this on our own. It's time to expand your system and whatever feels most nourishing to you. Of like, it doesn't mean that y'all are not capable. It just means that sometimes like interrupting that, like we're spinning our wheels sensation of like, but we're not getting anywhere. Someone else coming in, whether be that a therapist or someone that is more of an advisor, Or yeah, I think that can be a helpful interruption to that. Be like, oh, okay, like now we're getting a little bit of movement, maybe not huge movement, but at least we're getting some air. We're able to like kind of think and breathe and like figure it out a little bit differently.
Yeah, absolutely. Expanding your system when you're stuck, definitely a good tenet to live by. Very marriage and family therapist oriented tenet, but helpful nonetheless.
Mhm.
Yeah, I agree with all of those. Absolutely. Well, I've loved this conversation. As
Yeah.
we're wrapping up here, was there anything else that we didn't get to or that you wanted to make sure to highlight or reemphasize kind of as we're coming to a close?
Uh, I really enjoy the conversation too, and I found myself really wanting to get into like each topic area a ton and be like, well, think about this and do, what about this and reflect on this. And I just want to acknowledge that I created a course called Marriage Prep that does go into a lot of detail. And so if you felt like we were bouncing around a little bit, like I felt like I was bouncing around, like, what about that? Like, let's go there, let's go there. That's okay. We're hoping to just kind of illuminate again that there's some other resources for you to like unpack this. Like the course that I created is very much more structured, has a lot of reflection questions for each of the partners to take. You can just take a minute to do this individually for each section, like basically all those topic areas of, I want to ask myself these questions so then I can have time to process what this means to me individually before I then have the conversation with my partner. And so, yeah, I just want to share that as a resource. I think that'll be helpful to kind of almost like tie everything we talked about together because I could sit here and talk for another 4 hours around so many different other parts of consideration for this sort of approach to therapy.
Absolutely. We definitely could have like chosen any one of those topics and done a whole podcast on just one of them. But
It's true.
it's yeah, your course again, I'm not biased or anything, but you did a really fantastic job with that course and it is a really great overview as a resource that also gives a little more in-depth considerations that you can do on your own. Shout out to any of those Together in Texas folks trying to
Yeah.
get that discount on their marriage license,
Hmm.
especially. But really, honestly, it's called marriage prep. But like we said, like anyone who's considering a long-term relationship and wants to make sure that they're covering their blind spots and kind of taking everything into consideration and having those conversations, it's a fantastic resource for that.
Yep.
So speaking of, are there any other resources or ways to find you, Mandy Rorick?
Yeah, you can go to my website, www.mandy, M-A-N-D-I, Roarke, ROARKE.com. That's for my private practice. You can also go to zeshow.com to go to our resource library. That's where there's marriage prep. There's also like a marriage prep workshop that was a live workshop, pretty similar, but a different format. The marriage prep course is much more in depth with those resources as far as like the questions are concerned. And so, yeah, I recommend you checking those out. And then, of course, just feel free to reach out to me via my website or through our social media accounts, as I'm kind of blending two worlds here with my Mandy Rourke practice and Zeshow. But you can find me at either of those. And also, I have other therapists in my network that love doing premarital and couples therapy too. So I'm always happy to offer referrals of someone who would be a good fit for you.
Yeah, we'll have all that in the show notes as well. Thanks so much for having this conversation,
Thank
Mandy. I love
you.
talking about one of your favorite areas of specialty and picking your brain and hoping that everyone gets to see just how much you get to offer and all the couples on a regular basis. So,
Yeah. Well, thank you. I enjoyed it too. And I'm here for anyone who needs some additional support.
yeah, so is that show.
Yeah.
All
Bye, everybody.
right. Bye, guys.